Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Tuesday. My name is Joyce Hunter, and I'm the Executive Director for the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology. And I want to welcome you to today's ICIT briefing entitled Transform Your Analytics, Unlock Hidden Insights in Your Data. We want to extend a special welcome to our ICIT members and thank them for their support. I want to start by thanking our partner, a corporate member of ICIT, for partnering with us on today's briefing as our technology expert. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, partners like Alteryx are crucial to keeping our briefings freely available, and we are so grateful for their support, and you will hear from them later in the program. Today's session is focused on the topic that we talked about a little bit earlier, and we will explore two crucial areas: explainable AI and the importance of comprehensive datasets. This webinar will showcase how explainable AI makes complex data models transparent and interpretable, enabling users to understand the decision-making process behind data analysis. By building trust and confidence in the results, explainable AI empowers decision makers with actionable insights, leading to more informed and effective decisions. Additionally, we will discuss the significance of comprehensive data sets in democratizing data. Through the development of cross-functional, cross-agency working groups, organizations can better understand their data assets. This approach allows for a holistic utilization of diverse data sources, minimizing the potential for uncovering hidden insights that enhance decision-making processes. Please, we thank you for enjoying this insightful webinar and unlocking the hidden potential in your data. I'm excited to introduce our esteemed panel of experts to share their perspective on today's topic. We have Robert King, the Chief Data Officer for the U.S. Department of Energy, Reza Rashidi, Director of Research, Applied Analytics and Statistics Division, Internal Revenue Service, Jim Routh, an ICIT Fellow, former Chief Security Officer and Board Member, and Erica Reuter, Senior Manager, Sales Engineering for the U.S. Public Sector of Alteryx. So, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your being here. Okay, let's start off with the first question. In what ways can comprehensive data sets contribute to democratizing data within an organization? And let's start with you, Reza. Oops.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes.
Great. I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I do want to make one correction. The Executive Director of Data Management for the Research Analytics and Statistics. And so about comprehensive data sets. I'll provide one example. One of the problems that we have focused on is trying to understand the taxpayers' experience where interacting with IRS. You know, some taxpayers' interactions are very simple. A lot of the taxpayers actually, which is what we'd like it to be. They file the tax return and they get the refund, or that's the end of the whole process. And hopefully everybody's happy, and that's a great journey. So we call those taxpayer journeys. But then there are a lot of other types of interactions where a taxpayer might file, they might be missing some documentation, there might be various discrepancies between the filing and the data that we have and so on. So it could lead to other events in the whole life cycle of that tax processing. So one of the things we have done is by bringing in data from a lot of different sources that of basically systems that are used for managing different the steps in that process together. We've been able to put together what we call taxpayer journey, so we can understand the entire journey that the taxpayer and their interactions with the IRS goes through, including from their, if they call in and ask a question, their phone call, or if they visit a customer service center, what type of the question they have and all that. So by bringing all of this data together from their account information, and basically by also having access to longitudinal data of those interactions. In addition, the text, the unstructured data from the transcripts of their conversations or notes that the customer service representatives have taken in those interactions. We're able to understand, so if you think about individual taxpayer, we have something over 160 million, around 160 million type of filings. So we're able to segment the taxpayers into various segments and understand the process that they go through. We are segmenting by journey type, but not not necessarily by individual characteristics. We can segment by many different perspectives. So by the different journey types, we can segment them and understand a certain type of journey, and if it's taking too long, it's resulting to too many phone calls or too many interactions. So we define that as, we have defined metrics that we call taxpayer effort, to measure the total effort that they go through from this, all of that, and then try to identify the pain points in that journey, and then identify customer service improvements that can be put in place, and then also after the improvement has been put in place, measure the same type of journey and kind of measure the improvements. This is not possible by data from any individual system. So we have individual systems that are supporting taxpayer interactions. We have systems that track the taxpayer filings and calculations and so on. So basically, it's a very robust example of pulling together data from many different systems. And without that, this type of analysis would not be possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Reza, for your response. Anybody else want to contribute to the answer to this question? And I'll repeat the question. In what ways can comprehensive data sets contribute to democratizing data within an organization? Okay, I will go on to the next question. How can cross-functional, cross-agency working groups facilitate a better understanding of an organization's data sets? Rob? Rob, can you hear us? I know he was having problems with his audio previously. Jim, do you want to take that question?
Sure. Joyce, decades ago, we started building data warehouses and structuring data for specific purposes. When we created the data source, we always had an idea of how to use it in terms of what the process would be and what the purpose would be. And in fact, the technologies that we use and the techniques were pretty much single-threaded. Basically take raw data, process it in a certain way, produce a specific output. And the design of the data structure was predicated on the output in terms of what we wanted. And so today we've got tools and capabilities of taking data in multiple formats, ingesting that data, and really doing a lot of manipulation of that data for a changing set of requirements. So both the processes and the outcome evolves and changes. In fact, in some cases, we're using data sources for purposes that we never imagined, simply because we have the capability of doing that. Well, a better way of getting an understanding how to use data and the right data management techniques is to have cross-functional forums, if you will, or governance structures that help us understand the different purposes of using data. And understanding the different purposes gives us a lot more flexibility in thinking about how to design ultimately the processes and the output. So cross-functional teams often will look at the same data from two very different perspectives. And that's healthy because then designing, capabilities will incorporate those perspectives. And in fact, there could be dozens of different perspectives. And, today's tooling and capabilities really lend itself to a lot of flexibility in changing and evolution of the requirements. So understanding the different uses of the data helps, and often in organizational units that only handle data a specific way, you tend to get somewhat siloed in how you're thinking about both the data structure and how to use it. And broadening that is healthy and helpful for the entire enterprise.
Well, let's pull on that thread a little bit, Jim. So, what options exist today? So, if an enterprise seeking AI governance, and in my experience, a lot of people when they hear governance run. So,
Hmm.
how do you engage them in adopting a governance from a data perspective?
Well, I'll give you an example. We've learned a lot about online behavioral data in the last, say, 5 to 10 years, in terms of how people use technology. And a lot of times when we build applications, we make certain assumptions about what users want and how they want that data be presented and what they can do with the data. By studying the data from the behavioral uses of the application, we have a much better understanding of how the data is actually being used and consumed by the digital consumer. And it may not be what we intended, but understanding how it's actually being used can help us evolve and adjust to hit the mark from, let's say, a functionality standpoint. Now, it turns out the same data, the behavioral data of how digital consumers are interacting with applications, can be used for other purposes, say for authentication purposes.
Mm.
So if we create a pattern of known behavior and tie that to a profile, we can validate that the behavior matches that pattern, and that becomes a form of authentication that doesn't have any impact on the end user, so it's not cumbersome, but it's an ongoing way of confirming that the right person is using the application. The same application data can be used by somebody creating a graphical user interface or design of the application based on where they're clicking on the real estate that's offered to them, and adjusting the application over time based on that. Again, same data, behavioral application data, being used for two very different purposes. And that's the beauty of understanding data structures to be able to support evolving and changing needs for the enterprise.
Great, thank you so much. Erica, what are some of the potential benefits after hearing what Reza said as far as how they're using the different data sets for taxpayer customer service or customer experience, as well as what Jim said about using data that might be for different intended purposes for something else. So how do you see from a broad perspective the potential benefits of utilizing a diverse data source in decision making?
All of these topics have to do with data democratization, right? So the idea that back in the day, IT controlled all of the data, and if you want an answer to a question, you ask IT. What we're able to do now, and the benefit of this, is the domain experts, the people who do the job day in and day out, they can now go in and get the answers to their questions. And they know how to interpret the data for the specific answers that they want to get. Sometimes when we rely on a third party, IT, a data scientist, someone who's not doing our job every day, brilliant people, but they don't think the same way that we do because we're doing it, right? They might not necessarily look at the problem the same way, and a lot of back and forth occurs. So this is a great efficiency saver. Naturally, it requires a lot of governance. It requires a lot of safety measures to be put in place, but it does really allow us to get the answer to the question. In terms of the diversity of the data sources, well, as Jim mentioned, very rarely is the answer to the question you want in just one single siloed data set, right? So the diverse data sources really allows us to do some rich analytics. It also allows us to understand anomalies, understand when things might look a little biased when we're looking at a single data source. It helps us with sampling, making sure our data samples make sense. You know, the story I like to tell about this is, I want to say it was in the 80s. There was a professor who was doing a study on addiction. And this professor concluded that there is a distinct relationship between drinking milk as a child and developing heroin addiction. And that's crazy, right? So the reason that happened is because the entire sample of data, one data set, was interviews with heroin addicts in rehab. And they all drank milk as a child, right? But we didn't look at the diverse data source. We didn't look at the external data source of people who did not have that addiction, right? So it's very important that these are all governed, that the democratization is there, and that we really do look at diverse data sources to make sure we're not biased and to give the complete answer to the question.
Thank you very much, Erica. Let's go down that road a little bit. Unintended consequences, and using variety of different data sources. How would you, and I'm going to ask all three of you that same question, what are some ways that, particularly Reza, with you, and I don't, is Rob back yet? Rob, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Okay, so let's go back to that question, Rob. What are the potential benefits? You've heard everybody put in their comments about governance and benefits of utilizing diverse data sources. From a Department of Energy, what are your thoughts around that and governance?
Yeah, so let me just quickly speak to the fact that I was a data leader at the Department of Homeland Security and then the Social Security Administration. And then about 8 weeks ago, I joined the Department of Energy to be their chief data officer. So I've been able to experience very different missions, different organizations, different structures around data as it applies to the contextual application and missions. One of the things I think in talking about the value of democratizing data is just some of the efficiencies that can be gained. There's lots of research about the amount of time that our data practitioners and data scientists spend on non-value added activities. 50% of their time looking to find, position, and validate data for application. 30% of firm revenues lost to poor data quality and non-value data activities. So just the effectiveness and efficiency we can get by getting, governed data into the hands of the data scientists and the data engineers and practitioners so that they can apply it in novel and new manners. So I think that is just the effectiveness we can get from that, the opportunities to reduce data silos, which can, drive, the breaking down of organizational barriers and organizational silos, and to enable further contextualization of the data for that integrated and broader business application. So these are all areas where by integrating and using data creates this virtuous flywheel where data is then further reinvested in and treated as that critical asset to transform the business and mission capabilities of that organization. So I think that's what we're seeing in these dynamics, is that better understanding of how we treat data as that strategic asset.
Well, Rob, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to advancing this enterprise data and analytics program that develop these comprehensive data sets?
I think there's two major obstacles, and they're not tied to technologies. I think they're really cultural, and it's a legacy mindset towards data control. That are the two biggest obstacles. I say it tongue in cheek that chief data officers and chief analytic officers are as much corporate psychologists as they are data practitioners. These are, the organizations I've worked in have been large and complex with different missions, different systems, different funding streams. And there's this idea of, the data is mine, right? And how the data is, from a power standpoint, data has been historically seen as the data you control is the source of your power. And I think the information era has taught us that the data that you provide to the collective knowledge pool is now, and the consumers you build of your data is actually now where we can get our power source from, right? And we're seeing that mind shift, hopefully, in industry and government, that the information those who came up in it have learned from, and this is impacting views on data. So how do we then harness that to govern data, manage it in a way that we can start changing that culture, to realize that we have to invest in data literacy and data training programs to ensure that, if we've been for generations investing in things like Lean Six Sigma, right, which promote highly efficient processes. But if we've rewarded human behavior for efficiencies, but now we want to insert data quality and data capture, which may actually make us inefficient, and we've rewarded efficiencies, how do we now say the data literacy and data capture and data quality need to be balanced against those efficiencies? And what are the strategic trade-offs we're going to make as an organization to that data literacy and to that data capture, so that we have quality data from which we can build our data pipelines and measure data quality? So it's that type of change and cultural change and that legacy mindset of what is data and how do we invest in it through policies, processes, reward systems, performance management, that I think we're undergoing right now. I think industry is getting there with some of their capabilities, and they're seeing that. I'm hoping that government is following suit.
Very interesting. 10 years ago, when I was the deputy CIO over at the Department of Agriculture, the administration came out with an executive order on open data, right? Anybody remember that? And some of the challenges I know that I had over at Department of Agriculture was exactly what you said, Rob. It's my data, mine, like a 2-year-old. And what do you want with it? And how do you, take care of it? And who gets to see it? And when we first started out, we got cats, dogs, rabbits, anything when they made the first call for open data sets. And we realized very quickly that we had the first call for data sets, we got 85. Okay. Department of Agriculture, 27 agencies, staff offices, and mission areas, and we could only pull 85 data sets. So exactly what you're talking about. We had to make it mission focused. So going on, we made it so we had fire and water or fire and drought. And so those agencies that were specifically interested in those submitted those data sets, and we had rural development and things like that. So Reza, when you look at IRS and you are talking about governance and gathering of data and making it a cultural transformation, how are you doing that over at IRS?
So I wanted to make a couple of comments about some of the things that I heard in terms of the governance. I think there is governance as a risk mitigation approach. It's very important. For example, I love the example that Erica mentioned in terms of how you can make such a terrible conclusion, such a biased conclusion if you're, from your sample data set or data set if it's biased already in conclusion. So those are the types of risks and the governance process has to mitigate. So in that sense, if governance focuses on basically risk mitigation, at least one part of it, I think that's where you can show the value it brings to the process. One of the specific things, for example, and what is the right purpose of the data. For example, in IRS, the data that IRS has, the taxpayer data, there are statutory constraints about how the data can be used. For example, we can't use of the taxpayer data for economic studies is controlled under different statutes than use of the taxpayer data for tax administration. So different types of levels. So how, just because, as Jim mentioned, kind of like we have a large data warehouse, we pull all the data together, and that's really the main source of a lot of the analytics we do. But we need to be careful in terms of our governance process to make sure that the data is used for the right purpose, for the purpose we are authorized to use that. This may or may not be an issue for a lot of non-government companies and organizations, but at least for us, it's something that's important. Another aspect of that that's important is that while pulling the data together in data warehouse or in modern techniques via data lakes or some other way of providing access to all of the data is really important for democratization and availability of data for analytics. It also could potentially pose a security issue. So how do you, how do you segment or how do you control access? So, you do want to provide access to as much of the data as possible for the right purpose, but then you also need to control, make sure you have adequate controls in there for security purposes. So if somebody is, again, I'll use a IRS example. If somebody is authorized to work on individual taxpayer data, well, they don't need to look at the company tax data, for example, business tax data. So they need to be, even though we might have all of that in the warehouse, we're not, we're controlling.
It's 1:30.
I think those are all important in terms of if you have a governance process that's focused on helping mitigate risk and ensure that you have processes in place where it does make access to the data and utilization easier, but at the same time, it has to be keep in mind, all of those risk mitigations that are needed both from the right use and also security purposes. So it's not an easy process to put in, but that's really necessary for effective use.
Exactly. Jim, I saw your head nodding up and down there.
Yeah, so one of the things I have to kind of acknowledge on behalf of all cybersecurity professionals is that I probably spent at least 10 years of my cybersecurity career forcing individuals to own data. And so the whole idea of now democratizing that data flies in the face of what we spent years driving, because there were a lot of times, I work for like a really big bank, and we had like a multi-million-dollar initiative to try to decommission applications that had data that nobody owned, or nobody raised their hand and said, yeah, I need this data, or I'm using this data, or we're using this application. And we're spending millions of dollars to basically support systems that had outgrown their usefulness, and whoever decided they wanted to build those systems have long gone, left the bank, and so we're just running them. So we would go around, find these orphans essentially and decommission them, but we'd first have to find out if anybody owned the data or was willing to take ownership. And of course, to the degree that we had important data assets, we forced ownership to be the stewards, to determine the life of a system and what to do with the data and how long to retain the records, and and so much accountability was driven based on that. So the other thing I want to point out is that in this model of democratizing data, where you have data sources that anybody can use for different purposes, the kind of the allure of that is that there are no gatekeepers, right? That I can do anything, and as my needs change, I can use the data in whatever way you want. Well, the only way to actually balance that with the right level of governance, or a level of governance, is to filter the data as it's populated into whatever data structure is being used, whatever repository of data is being used, or the models running that on that data, is to put some level of control to populate it and then to control the output. So it's kind of the front end and the back end. And this is very conventional in terms of data management governance. And that's one way of putting at least some structure to balance the risk associated with using that data. Now, there are techniques that we can use inside the data. So differential privacy would be one, or homomorphic encryption would be another. Now, these are more advanced, more complicated, a lot more challenging to implement, but they also open up the opportunity of protecting certain types of data, but running analytics across that data that anybody can use for different purposes. So, for example, I worked in healthcare for a long time, and health records, individual patient records, are just a rich source of information for treatment strategies and understanding health.
Okay, Jim froze up
But
there
the
for
comes for
Here
those
we go.
treatment strategies from a health provider perspective. The same data companies to figure out the the claims processing of what claims to allow under what conditions, and the same data could be used for research, for academic research, to figure out new methods and techniques for serving patients. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry looks at a part of that by saying, what new drugs and medications can we come up and develop, and how big is the market to allow us to do that? Now, all of that is being driven on the same health-oriented data, but I think all of us can recognize that if our personal data was in that data set, would we want our social security number used as a unique identifier? And the answer is no, I don't think so, because the criminals would really like that, and that would be problematic, right? So these are kind of the things that we have to do some level of filtering. And of course, the evolution of large language models today and public large language models just kind of blows this out of proportion in terms of, wow, what kind of governance we put in place to even ensure that that data is accurate and correct and robust. And there's some challenges obviously associated with that.
Thank you. That was greatly appreciated, Jim. Going back to Rob, you were at Social Security and now you're at Department of Energy. What are your thoughts about, placing these systems under basically almost under lockdown? And I guess maybe the larger question is, 10 years later from the open data executive order, why are we still in the same place? Anybody can jump in and answer, and we can just go.
So I can tell you that right now in government, we have a lot of competing regulatory drivers, and we need to understand how those various regulations, laws, guidelines are being interpreted and where they are stood up in an organization. So there are some of our older organizations. One of the major initiatives we had going on at SSA was, our applications were grown organically and that had been stood up with individual Privacy Act statements and system record notices. And as we transform from an application-centric to a customer-centric journey, and how we looked at unlocking data using master data management practices as we looked for an API-first strategy, how did we ensure that the chief privacy officer, our general counsel, our IT, our data teams were all working in concert with moving us towards the Privacy Act statements and the system record notices that had grown up organically towards more modern data management practices, where we could, align those around protecting the data behind the SSA firewall, or whatever organizational firewall, but then moving towards these modern data management practices and ecosystems so that we could truly unlock that data and we could join the data and integrate it in novel ways that allowed us to actually better, more proactively and more comprehensively support the customer and serve the customer. And so I think it's, this tension, right? And sometimes it's healthy tension, but and that's probably by design, but it definitely makes change and modernization challenging when you have so many stakeholders who have vested interest and maybe competing guidelines into how we drive towards these end state visions around privacy versus open data.
Okay. Erica, going off of what Rob said, so what steps can organizations take to ensure the integrity and quality of their comprehensive data sets?
I just want to add before I answer that question, as a private citizen, I am thrilled the IRS has such, rigid requirements and is making sure that data is only accessed on an as-needed basis. Breaches are real. I worked in law enforcement for many, many, many years before working in technology, and there's been a shift. It doesn't make sense to steal a car anymore. An ID is so much more valuable. Data is money. But with that said, we can't control it. We can't. It cannot be controlled. And I work with a lot of schools now with the Chat GPT and the LLMs coming up who are facing the same problem. They can't control it. They can't stop kids from using it. They can't stop the public from feeding things in. So it's a matter of, what do you do? How do you make it as reasonable as possible? So to your point, Joyce, and to your question, the integrity of the data, the quality of the data, working with what we have to do with an open framework, there's a lot of things we should be doing. The democratization helps. It allows for the domain expertise to be there and to ensure the data is of quality. Naturally, we do need those pipelines. I think I've heard every single panelist mention data pipelines, and that is so critical. You can't count on things to be entered perfectly. You can't count on things to be queried perfectly, but you can count on a computer to automate a process to check, right? You can make sure that you have those gates in place. So the data pipelines are ever so important. Auditability is ever so important. And just having the idea there that we can make sure we're cleaning things, we're checking it, we're using federated queries, we've got security in place, and the data is complete. It's complete, it's relevant, and it's auditable. And that is truly the best we can do.
So there's nothing automatic, right? It's the same old saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, I think there's automated steps, right, that can help with making it more manageable, adding to the integrity. I don't think there's a single thing we can do. I think there's many little things we can do, and that speaks to a lot of the suggestions that the panelists have put forth today.
Okay, so
Yeah, there are, Joyce,
ahead,
there are tools that allow us to filter inputs, and there are tools that allow us to filter outputs in terms of robustness. But you mentioned earlier a term of explainability, and that's actually the only way to do that is through humans. So you have to have a human in the loop who understands the data sources, the data sets, the how that data is being used, what models are being used, what are the outcomes from the models, and some accountability for the quality of the outcome, or to know that the outcome is reasonable and can be effectively used in a business context or an organizational construct. So it takes humans. It takes a human in the loop to get that explainability. And the good news is that technology is making a lot of things easier. So if we just look at data ingestion, in other words, how we put data from multiple sources into a data repository of any kind, the tools that we have at our disposal today are far more sophisticated than we've ever had to get that clean data into data repositories. So, and the same for output. we have, you know, a lot better technologies, a lot better tools at our disposal. Certainly with AI, it's a game changer in terms of both ML as well as using LLMs, both internal LLMs and potentially public LLMs. However, with all the range of capability we have at our disposal today, you need humans. You need humans for the governance side of this. You mentioned that word earlier, and you know, we like to think that we can have unfettered, ungoverned data, which we can, but you're going to have the negative consequences associated with unfettered, ungoverned data as well. So it takes people. At the end of the day, we're much more productive because we have better tools, but we're dependent upon people to get to that level of explainability.
And I love that you're talking about explainability. I think that is the key right now. You know, when we're children and a rule has come forth and your mom or dad says, because I told you so. That's not okay, right? You know, you need to understand the why, you need to understand the how, you need to understand how this model came up with this, or where the data came from, or how it was joined. The explainability, I feel like, builds trust. And, you know, Rob mentioned some of the cultural barriers that we have. The explainability goes so far to assist with that as well.
Great. And so, you know, talking about explainability, so all the rumors about AI taking all of our human jobs, so that's not real?
There's more reality to AI creating different human jobs to replace the tasks that we will be jettisoning. So it's more of an evolution to where, you know, there are certain jobs that we won't need people doing those jobs, and therefore there will be displacement. However, anyone who has intellectual curiosity will be able to invest their, you know, time and effort to learn how to use the enabling capability of AI. And there are going to be just as many, if not more, jobs for using AI effectively. So there's no question there's a fundamental shift that's taking place, and jobs are changing. But you know, it's our responsibility as professionals, invest and use our intellectual curiosity to learn the new skills, and the new skills are how to use AI. And there's plenty of jobs opening, and there will be a shortage of talent as there is today in cybersecurity and data science. There will be tomorrow.
And you know, you mentioned something, all of you mentioned it, but explainable AI, how can that help decision makers gain trust and confidence in the results of data analysis?
Well, as far as federal government is concerned, there is an executive order, the 13960, that requires explainability and disparate impact measurements and various factors that are very important to AI, or you know, a lot of what we call AI today, you know, we used to call statistical learning or modeling. So I like to use the term advanced analytics or AI, you know, like interchangeably, rather than debating if it's AI or not. But a lot of the issues apply to that, and I think there are actually risks. Yes, there are definitely a lot of opportunity with the specific with, for example, generative AI or large language models, for example, in terms of access to data. There are a lot of products out there right now that you can say, build me a dashboard that tells me, you know, like this income or whatever over the last month, and it can automatically build you a dashboard. You don't need to be a data scientist to get into that detail. It can even learn from the previous queries, and you can provide. So these are all great and very useful, very interesting. But especially generative AI with large language models, I think there's potential for a lot of misuse, especially in these areas, because all language models are patterns of plausible sentences. They're not logical deductions. So if you're using a language model to draw an inference whether this type of access pattern was fraudulent, like for example in cybersecurity or some other areas, it's quite possible that, it could be a good way of using that to give you an idea for the type of things to look at. But if those are done automatically and decided, as we've seen a lot of the examples for what they call hallucination, generating facts that doesn't even exist. So if you want to, like in the legal cases, so because it's not even designed to do like case-based reasoning, like in legal context or mathematics, that's not what it's built for. But the fact that it's trained on such large volumes of, such large corpus, it makes it comes up with sentences, if you ask it comes up with sentences that sounds really close to reality. And if you just take that and use it, which I think there is a huge concern, huge risk of that, people, if you don't really understand what it does and the inherent risk in that can be a lot of, so that's the kind of thing that you want to make sure you have governance around. So is it being used in the right context, or is it being used in a context that it's risky? And if it is in a context that's risky, how is it can automate some of the steps. It can help the productivity, but how do you validate? How do you have to the validation that you need to have in order before you use the recommendations and the results there? I think it's becoming more complicated. So I think governance.
In the end, you own that decision, right? Just like
Yeah.
Jim said, you wanted to own the data, you own that decision. And, I think it's always semantics. It bothers me when people bring this up, but I'm going to do it. Machine learning and AI are not the same thing. They're intertwined, right? So if you have a newer car and it does lane detection or crash detection, hey, you're about to hit something, you should react. That's machine learning. When it pushes the brakes for you, when it impersonates a human, that's AI. So to Reza's point, that's where for high risk activities, I think we absolutely should embrace the machine learning. We need the explainability because you need to defend that decision. You need to defend why this action was taken versus having a robot take over and make the choice for you.
Yeah, I think if all of you have received, this is like a good case example to take the temperature. If all of you have a phishing email from a year ago in your storage or in your email, take a look at it and take a look at the readability of it. Put that aside, and 1 year from now, do the same thing. Find a phishing email that comes across, look at your spam folder, and then read it. And you'll notice a fundamental difference in quality. And that fundamental difference in quality is criminals using the LLM against us to improve the attack vectors or improve the attacks that we're seeing. And we're already starting to see it today, but I think it's going to be a lot. I think, basically what criminals do is they go where the money is and they follow the money, right? And so the most successful techniques that are used for phishing are shared and used by criminals through syndicates. And so we're already seeing results today of phishing emails becoming far more accurate and far more difficult to discern whether they're real, legitimate or not, simply by LLMs being used. And we're going to see a lot more of that. So, again, you need a human in the loop ultimately for governance.
Great. Well, we have about 7 minutes left, 7 or 8 minutes. I wanted to open it up to our listening audience, our viewing audience, and to see if there are any questions. If there are, please provide them in the chat, and we will be very happy to answer them for you. But while we are gathering some answers for us, Rob, for your national labs, are you using AI to do some cross-functional or cross-disciplinary discussions of the data that's gathered by each one of the labs?
So I would say that is probably starting to happen organically at a lab-to-lab level, where there are, probably some synergies. The labs have done a great job self-organizing and finding ways, but they are also contractor owned, right? 16 of the 17 labs are contractor owned, so there's also some competition amongst them as well. So we, again, I've only been here 7 weeks, and I've met with several of the labs, and I'm incredibly impressed with their desire to find that ability to both share but protect their intellectual property. And so we are going to look for opportunities to find areas where we think it makes sense to share, where we can collect data, govern it effectively, secure it effectively to protect their IP. And we're going to have to find that balance, and incentivizing them in a holistic way from a headquarters perspective is a very delicate path to row. So we are looking at that, and I'm very encouraged by the receptiveness the labs are showing towards wanting to find that. I think that they understand that all boats rise with the tide, and they all want to be contributing to the collective knowledge pool, but they also want to ensure that they're protecting their equities.
Absolutely. Well, I don't see any questions. So in closing, we have about 7 minutes left.
Hey, Joyce, I think there's
Yes.
one question. Can you offer a definition of explainable AI?
Okay, I didn't see that. All right.
So
You want to start, Jim?
I'll offer a definition. Yeah, explainable AI means that data sources in terms of the origin of the data source. The data sets that are used by the models, and how the models work. And when I say a person can explain what the data source is, how the data is being processed or manipulated, and what the outcomes, whether the outcome's valid or not. That's explainable AI. It almost infers accountability for a human to make it explainable. That's my definition. Hopefully that helps. I think it was Colleen that asked.
If I may add to that, I would explain it as you need to be able to explain the reason for the outcomes of the model. It's not necessarily about the documentation of the model, like if it's a complex statistical model or neural-like model or something like that. Especially like in large language models, you can't really explain them per se. That's where explainability is very low. But if you can describe the reason for the outcomes, like for example, if you're using a risk modeling, like what is this characteristics of input or this characteristic of individual or event made it more risky, or you need to be able to explain that.
Okay. Anybody else want to contribute to the explanation of explainability? Okay, well, we will go on to our final question. For each of you, please, what is the most important lesson or takeaway you want to be sure attendees leave from today's briefing? And Rob, we'll start with you.
So I think we'll hit on that last point about explainable AI. I think for the government, this is going to be critical. It is, we are going to be held to a higher standard of fairness, ethics, and transparency that explainable AI will need to help as we go on this journey. AI is quickly becoming commoditized in terms of the amount of applications that are occurring in the marketplace. But the data pipelines and the logic and making sure that we have transparency so that the unintended outcomes of these decisions and these models can be mitigated. We need to have the ability to have these models and the data that sources them defined and described in layman's terms to allow decision makers, policy makers, auditors, regulators, and anyone impacted to be able to scrutinize the data and the models. You said it, junk in, junk out, right? We need to ensure that AI doesn't magnify poor decisions or incomplete decisions because we didn't think about the data and the data pipelines from the inception. So that means well-cultivated, curated data pipelines where we have the lineage, we have the logic defined. I think that that is going to be where chief data officers and data practitioners are really going to be challenged to enhance their governance and their cultivation of data, so that as these models become more complex and larger, that we have the ability to ensure they're defensible from a outcome standpoint.
Reza?
Yeah, I'll actually echo and maybe continue on what Rob said, is that it's a very exciting times with a lot of the AI capabilities and the volume of data we have and that we can manage and access. There are lots and lots of new opportunities that have that did not exist maybe even as little as 5 or 10 years ago. And that's true for all of the federal government agencies as well as private sector. At the same time, I think there is a time that the potential for risk is also very high. Jim talked about, for example, risk of new attack vectors, because these same capabilities are available to the fraudsters. But in addition to that, we talked about the explainability and what Rob was talking about, and bias and so on, and the example Erica mentioned, and all of that are very good examples of that. If there are a lot of AI tools today that actually make it easy for a novice to be able to build a model and use something. And if they don't have those understandings and they, they're not careful and use that I think, introduces a lot of risk. So it can come up with wrong conclusions, biased outcomes, and I think it's very important for those to be managed or governed.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah, I think we, as any organization, government, private sector, doesn't matter, we have an obligation and responsibility to do AI governance, and that's intertwined or intermingled with data governance. And when I say that, I'm suggesting not that we block or stop access to LLMs, because I don't think that's possible. I think this is a highly exciting and disruptive technology. And I think all of us have to invest in learning how to harvest it or harness it in an effective way. And we all have an obligation, responsibility to kind of lean in, learn more about it, and learn how best to apply governance models that enable the business opportunities and the tremendous gains that we can have, balancing the risk of some of the downside. And it's not, we don't delegate it to one function or team in the enterprise. We all have to make that investment. And each of us do it in our own disciplines, and I think we'll be better off. But AI governance has to be a thing across enterprises, and I think we're seeing that emerge. What Robert's talking about is really encouraging, and what Reza's talking about is really encouraging from a government perspective, and I think we need to see it in private industry as well.
And Erica, we'll give you the last word.
Certainly. As everyone said, it should be approached responsibly, and we're doing amazing things we could never do before. We're taking it to the next level, but unlocking hidden insights, doing predictive analytics, this isn't new. Reza mentioned it. We used to call it statistics. Our credit scores are this, right? You know exactly why your credit score is what it is. It's very explainable, and we've all accepted that as a reality. So, naturally, jump in carefully, but jump in. You're not going to be the first, and you're certainly not going to be the last.
Well, thank you to everyone for joining us today. We encourage you to visit us on www.icitech.org to access more of our free research and education. Please sign up for our fall briefing on October 4th, AIDC ICIT 2023, so you can be in the room where it happens. And we'll see you at our next ICIT briefing. Thank you. Live long and prosper.
Thank you.